The dust of Willowbend had a taste. It was a fine, red grit that settled on the tongue, in the folds of a dress, and in the deep cracks of a soul worn thin. It was the taste of a place where the law was a suggestion whispered against the authority of a gun barrel, and where a signed piece of paper was worth less than the calloused hand that held it. The wind, a constant and lonely preacher, sermonized across the endless Dakota prairie, carrying the scent of cured hides from the freight wagons and the fainter, more bitter smell of lives lived on the very edge of the map. This was the world that had claimed Eleanor Hart, or what was left of her. At 23, she felt a century old. The fever had taken her adoptive parents in the space of a single week, leaving her with a silence in their small sod house that was louder than any storm. They had been good people, kind people who had taken in an orphan and given her books instead of chores, filling her head with the grand thunder of Mr. Milton's poetry and the steady comfort of the Psalms. It was an education for a world of gas lamps and drawing rooms, not for this raw, unfinished country where the ability to build a smokeless fire was valued far more than a familiarity with Paradise Lost. Now, that education felt like a language no one else spoke. The knock on her door was not a question. It was a summons. She opened it to find the self-appointed council of Willowbend's wisdom standing on her threshold, their shapes dark against the brassy afternoon sun. There was Jed Kane, owner of the Lucky Ace Saloon, a man whose tailored vest and tidy mustache could not hide the abacus clicking behind his eyes. Every smile he offered was an act of calculation. Beside him, a mountain of a man, stood Silas Croft, the town blacksmith, whose silence was a physical weight. He believed in what he called the natural order of things, an order in which his own great strength and certainty sat very near the top. A few other grim-faced men shuffled behind them, their presence a silent endorsement. Jed Kane removed his hat, a gesture of politeness that did not reach his watchful gaze. He spoke of the town's concern, his voice a smooth river stone, a young woman, alone, without protection. It was an unseemly state of affairs, a disruption to the town's delicate balance. They had, in their benevolence, found two solutions for her predicament. The first was Bart Finch, a farmer, a widower twice over, with a parcel of land and 3 small children who needed a mother's hand. He was a decent man, Jed assured her, a hard-working man. The unspoken part of the offer hung in the air. He was also a man who smelled of sour dirt and whose hands were as rough as bark, a man whose company would be a slow grinding down of the spirit. Eleanor's heart grew cold and still. She looked past Jed's shoulder to the dusty street, to the unblinking sun. She said nothing, and so he presented the second option. The Lucky Ace was a booming enterprise, a respectable establishment. He was quick to add, for this part of the world, he was in need of a woman with a refined air to assist at the bar, to bring a touch of class to the place. The work was honest, the pay was fair, and a room above the saloon was included. He did not need to explain what that sort of assistance truly entailed, or what kind of class a lone woman would be expected to bring to a room full of lonely, hard-drinking men. The offer was a cage disguised as a perch. Eleanor looked from Jed Kane's predatory smile to Silas Croft's stony face of judgment. She saw her future laid out before her as 2 different roads leading to the same small death. One was a life of drudgery, of bearing children for a stranger and burying her books under the floorboards. The other was a life of public shame, of pouring whiskey and deflecting grabbing hands until she had nothing left of herself to protect. She drew a breath, the dusty air scraping her lungs. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the heavy silence of the small room with the clean edge of a new knife. "I thank you for your concern, gentlemen," she said, her eyes meeting Jed Kane's, "but I will not trade my life for a roof." The air did not just freeze, it shattered. Jed Kane's smile vanished, leaving a tight, bloodless line. Silas Croft shifted his immense weight, the floorboards groaning in protest, a low sound of disapproval from the earth itself. The other men looked at their boots, at the sky, anywhere but at the woman who had just refused their charity, their order. Jed Kane's composure returned, but it was a different kind now, harder and sharper. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a folded letter, tapping it against his knuckles. He did not open it, but he let the corner of it angle just so, enough for Eleanor to see the bold, arrogant signature at the bottom, Captain Reeves. The name belonged to the leader of the territorial militia, a man known more for his land acquisitions and violent temper than for keeping the peace. "A shame," Jed said, his voice losing its polish. "Some men, important men like Captain Reeves, believe a firm hand is needed to guide folks onto the right path. He has a great interest in this town's prosperity, and in seeing that its assets are properly managed." He slid the letter back into his pocket. But the message had been delivered. This was not about her welfare. It was about control. She was an asset, a loose piece on their board, and they intended to put her in her proper square. Her refusal was not just an inconvenience. It was a defiance of their power. The consequences were immediate. The town's mercy was a shallow well, and it had just run dry. The local preacher, a man with a spine of boiled cabbage, arrived within the hour. He wrung his hands and spoke of community harmony and a woman's duty, but his eyes darted away from hers. The church, he explained, could not in good conscience continue to provide shelter for someone who so willfully rejected the sound guidance of her neighbors. She had until dawn. The long, cool night of the prairie descended. Eleanor did not weep. The time for tears was over. Lost in the week the fever had raged, this was a time for choosing. She moved about the small, dark space, her hands sure and steady. What could she take? Not the heavy iron pot or the coarse wool blankets. She was walking away from the life they represented. Instead, she gathered the things that were truly hers. Her mother's Bible, its leather cover soft and worn as an old glove, its pages filled with a gentle, fading script. The book of Milton's poems, a heavy, solid weight that felt like an anchor to a different, more beautiful world. And from a small wooden box, she took the silver locket her birth mother had left her, its surface cool and smooth against her palm. It held no picture, only the faint, floral scent of a memory she could not quite grasp. These were her provisions: faith, poetry, and a mystery, a poor defense against the vast, hungry wilderness. As the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, Eleanor Hart stepped out of the sod house and did not look back. The lights of Willow Bend were dying behind her, the town curling into its mean, fitful sleep. Before her, the prairie stretched out like a silent, empty sea. She squared her shoulders, felt the weight of the small bundle in her arms, and set her face toward the rising sun. She chose to walk off the edge of their map, into the heart of the storm she knew must be coming. For the first few hours, the only adversary was the sun, a relentless hammer in a vast blue sky. The prairie was not flat, as it appeared from a distance, but a series of gentle, endless swells, like a petrified ocean. Walking it was a rhythm of climbing and descending, a physical prayer that left her gasping for breath. The world was stripped down to the burn in her legs, the rasp of her breathing, and the immense, indifferent silence of the land. There was no sign of human life, not a fence post, not a wagon rut. It was as if Willow Bend had been a bad dream, and she had woken into this larger, emptier reality. But the sky, which had been so clear and cruel, began to change. To the west, a stain of bruised purple appeared on the horizon, growing and spreading with unnatural speed. The wind, which had been a steady, hot breath, died away completely, leaving a heavy, expectant stillness, a strange, metallic smell. The scent of ozone tinged the air. Eleanor had seen prairie storms from the safety of her window, had watched the lightning fork and the rain fall in solid gray sheets. She had never been out in the open, a single, tiny, upright figure in a world about to be torn apart. The first gust of wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs and whipping her skirts around her legs. It was cold, a sudden, shocking chill in the heat of the day. The sun vanished behind a roiling mass of dark clouds. The world went from brass to lead in a matter of moments. Then the rain began, not as individual drops, but as a sudden, overwhelming deluge. It was as if the sky had simply fallen. The dry, cracked earth turned instantly to a slick, red mud that clung to her boots and the hem of her dress, each step an effort of pulling her feet from its greedy grasp. The wind howled, a chorus of mourning voices that seemed to come from every direction at once. She bent her head, trying to shield her face, her hair plastered to her scalp, cold water trickling down her neck. The bundle in her arms, her last worldly possessions, was growing heavy and sodden. She was trying to navigate a shallow gully when her foot slipped. There was no time to catch herself. Her ankle twisted beneath her with a sickening pop, and she went down hard into the mud and rising water. A cry of pain and shock was ripped from her throat, swallowed by the roar of the storm. She tried to push herself up, but a fresh wave of agony shot up her leg, and she fell back with a gasp. Her ankle was already beginning to swell, a hot, throbbing knot of misery. The water in the gully was a fast-moving stream now, tugging at her, pulling her down. And then she saw it. The bundle, her precious books and the locket, had been torn from her grasp. The water seized it, tossing it away from her. She watched, horrified, as the current tumbled it over and over. The pages of Milton's poetry, her mother's Bible, dissolving into the red, churning water. It was the final, brutal severing of her past. Her old life was literally washing away, becoming one with the mud. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She was alone, injured, with nothing. The storm was a living thing, a predator, and she was its helpless prey. Through the sheeting rain and her own tears of despair, she tried to crawl, to pull her injured leg out of the current, scrabbling for a handhold on the slippery bank. A flash of lightning bleached the world white for a split second, and in that stark, instantaneous light, she saw him, a horseman, sitting perfectly still on his mount not 20 yards away, a silhouette against the violent sky. He was part of the storm, a figure of immense and terrifying calm in the midst of the chaos. Another flash illuminated him for a heartbeat longer. She saw long black hair, unbound and streaming in the wind, a knife at his hip. He was not looking at the sky, but at her, his gaze a steady, unreadable pressure. Every horror story she had ever heard, every whispered fear of the frontier, coalesced into the form of that silent rider. He was the savage from the dime novels, the terror from the dark. Eleanor's breath caught in a sob. She tried to push herself backwards, away from him, dragging her useless leg through the mud. A futile, pathetic retreat. The water swirled around her waist, cold and insistent. The rider dismounted in a single fluid motion. He moved not with haste, but with an unnerving economy of purpose. He walked toward the water, his eyes briefly leaving her to follow the path of her lost bundle. He saw it, snagged on a half-submerged route downstream, and altered his course. He waded into the gully, the water pushing against his buckskin-clad legs, and plucked the sodden mass from the current. Then he turned and walked toward her. Eleanor flinched, pressing herself against the muddy bank. A trapped animal. He stopped a few feet away, holding the dripping bag. His face was stark, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, his skin the color of wet copper. His eyes were not cruel, as she had expected. They were dark and intelligent, and they were simply observing, taking in her pathetic state, the twisted ankle, the terror on her face. He held out the bundle. She stared at it, then at him, unable to move. With a small sigh, as if he had expected this, he set the bag on the bank beside her. Then, Before she could protest or even fully comprehend his intent, he bent down, slid one arm under her shoulders and another under her knees, and lifted her from the water. The movement was sure and surprisingly gentle. She was no small woman, but he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Her head fell against his chest, and she could feel the steady, calm rhythm of his heart through the wet buckskin. He carried her out of the gully and toward his horse, a sturdy, dark-colored animal that stood unbothered by the storm. He swung her up onto the horse's back, setting her sideways, and then mounted behind her in one smooth movement. He leaned forward, his voice a low rumble near her ear, spoken over the howl of the wind. The words were clipped, the English broken but clear. "Shelter, come." His body was a solid wall behind her, shielding her from the worst of the wind and rain. He was warm, a steady source of heat in the heart of the cold storm. He took the reins, and the horse began to move, its hooves sucking at the mud as it climbed out of the lowlands onto higher ground. Eleanor huddled against him, her terror slowly being replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She had no strength left to fight, or even to be afraid. She simply clung to the horse's wet mane and let herself be carried into the teeth of the gale by the stranger who had risen from it. They rode for what felt like an eternity, the world a gray, roaring blur. He seemed to navigate by instinct, his dark head turning this way and that, reading the landscape that was invisible to her, just as she felt she could hold on no longer, that she would slide from the horse into the mud and be lost forever. He slowed the animal. They were at the base of a low, rocky bluff. Tucked beneath an overhang was a shallow opening, barely a cave, but it was out of the direct assault of the wind and rain. He dismounted and lifted her down, setting her carefully on the dry, dusty ground inside the shelter. The abrupt cessation of the wind's roar was a blessing, leaving only the sound of the rain drumming on the rock above them. He left her for a moment, disappearing back into the storm. Eleanor watched him go, a flicker of her old fear returning, but he came back shortly, his arms laden with dry wood he had apparently gathered from the deep crevices of the bluff. She watched in quiet amazement as he worked. In the midst of a torrential downpour, he produced a small pouch, and with a piece of flint and steel, he coaxed a spark into a handful of dry tinder. He blew on it gently, shielding it with his body, and a tiny flame flickered to life. He fed it small twigs, then larger pieces, until a small, clean fire was burning, its warmth pushing back the damp chill of the cave. It was a simple act of survival, but to Eleanor, who could barely light a well-laid hearth with dry kindling, it was a miracle. It was an answer to every prejudice she had ever held, a quiet, powerful statement of competence in a world that had just stripped her of all of hers. He turned his attention to her. He knelt and gently examined her swollen ankle, his touch surprisingly deft. He went to the mouth of the cave and returned with a handful of leaves from a low-growing shrub. He crushed them between two stones, creating a fragrant green pulp. With his knife, he stripped a long, thin piece of bark from a sapling and split it into several flat, flexible pieces. He applied the herbal poultice to her ankle, its cool touch immediately soothing the hot, fiery pain. Then he laid the pieces of bark around her ankle and lower leg and bound them firmly in place with strips of leather from his saddle. It was a crude splint, but it held her leg immobile and secure. When he was done, he sat back on his heels and looked at her. He reached into another pouch at his belt and pulled out a long, thin strip of dried meat. It was dark and hard as a piece of wood. He offered it to her. She took it hesitantly, her stomach clenching with a hunger she had not realized she felt. The meat was tough and salty, and it took a long time to chew, but it was sustenance. It was life. As she ate, she looked at the man across the small fire. He had saved her from the storm, tended her injury, given her food and warmth. He had not asked her name, nor offered his. He had not questioned what a lone woman was doing in the middle of the prairie. He had simply acted, In the flickering firelight, his face was calm and serious. For the first time since leaving Willow Bend, Eleanor felt a tiny, fragile seed of something that was not fear or despair. It was the barest beginning of trust. The storm raged for hours, a wild, untamed god flinging thunder and water at the world. Inside the small rock shelter, the fire was a tiny, defiant sun. It held the chill at bay and painted dancing shadows on the stone walls, creating a bubble of warmth and fragile peace in the heart of the maelstrom. Eleanor sat with her back against the rock, her splinted leg propped before her. The throbbing ache had subsided to a dull, persistent pulse. She finished the last of the tough, smoky meat, the salt stinging her lips, the effort of chewing a strange comfort. For a long time, there was only the sound of the fire and the storm. The man sat on the other side of the flames, his posture relaxed but alert. He sharpened his knife on a smooth, flat stone. The rhythmic scrape a calming, domestic sound against the wild symphony outside. He did not stare at her, yet she felt his awareness. It was not the predatory watchfulness of Jed Kane, but a quiet, steady presence. He was simply there, a fact as solid as the rock surrounding them. The silence was a space to be filled, and she knew she must be the one to fill it. Her voice was rusty, a stranger to her own ears. "My name is Eleanor Hart." He paused in his work, lifting his dark eyes to meet hers across the fire. The flames cast a warm, flickering light on his face, softening its hard angles. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Dakota," he said. The name was like the land, simple and strong. He followed it with another word, a clarification, Lakota. He offered no other information, and he asked for none in return. He did not ask what a woman named Eleanor Hart was doing alone and injured on the prairie. He did not ask where she had come from or where she was going. His silence was a form of respect so profound it was almost a physical gift. He was respecting the story she was not yet ready to tell, honoring the pain she held behind her eyes. In Willow Bend, her life had been a subject for public debate and disposal. Here, in a cave with a man the world would call a savage, her privacy was an undisputed territory. As the storm began to recede, its roars diminishing to a distant grumble, Eleanor's own inner turmoil grew. The immediate threat was passing, and the larger, more complicated one loomed. Dakota would not leave her here. He would take her somewhere. To a fort, perhaps, or a trading post. And then what? A woman alone, with a story of being lost in a storm and found by an Indian. She would be an object of pity and suspicion. They would send her back to the world of Jed Kane and Bart Finch, back to the false choices that were no choices at all. The thought was a cold dread that settled in the pit of her stomach, worse than the fear she had felt during the storm. She had run from a cage only to find the wilderness was a different kind of trap, one that would inevitably funnel her back to the bars she had just escaped. The realization broke something open inside her, the carefully constructed walls of her composure, the pride that had carried her out of Willow Bend, crumbled. "I cannot go back," she said, the words a low, trembling whisper. Dakota stopped his work and looked at her fully, his gaze patient, inviting. "The society of my own people," she tried to explain, her voice thick with a sorrow she could no longer contain. "They offered me a home, but the price was myself, to be a man's property, or to be the property of many men. They called it a choice." She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. It was a choice between two different locks on the same door. I am more afraid of that than I was of the storm. She had spoken the truth of her heart to this stranger, this man of a different people, a different tongue. He listened without moving, his dark eyes holding hers. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply heard her. He accepted her confession as he had accepted her presence, a fact of the world to be acknowledged. A wild, desperate idea began to form in her mind. It was a leap into an even greater unknown, a path that did not exist on any map she had ever seen, but it was a path of her own making. "Take me with you," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "To your village. I have nothing. I know nothing of your life, but I can learn. I am not weak. I can work." The proposal hung in the air between them, audacious, perhaps insane. She, a white woman, an outsider, a wasiku, asking to be taken into a Lakota camp. It was a request that defied every rule of the world they both knew. Dakota's face was unreadable. He looked at her, his gaze moving from her eyes to the crude but effective splint on her leg, then to the sodden, pathetic bag of books that lay beside her. He looked at her hands, soft and pale, the hands of a woman who had never scraped a hide or dug for roots. Then his eyes returned to her face, and he saw not just the fear and the desperation, but the stubborn set of her jaw, the flicker of defiance that had not been washed away by the storm or the mud. He saw the same spirit that had made her walk out of her town and into the wilderness alone. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silence that stretched and stretched until Eleanor thought her heart would stop. In that silence, he was weighing her life, and his own, and the life of his people. Then, slowly, he gave a single, deliberate nod. The journey began the next morning. The world was washed clean, the air fresh and cool, the prairie grasses glittering with a million tiny diamonds of rainwater. Dakota lifted her onto his horse, then retrieved her muddy bundle of books, tying it securely to the saddle. He walked beside the horse, his stride long and easy, his hand resting lightly on the animal's neck. A steadying presence. Her ankle protested with every step the horse took, but the splint held it fast, and the pain was a bearable, distant thing. For 2 days, they traveled across a landscape that was no longer empty to her. It was a book, and Dakota was teaching her its language. He did not speak much, but he would point. He pointed to the way the clouds stretched in long, thin wisps, and said it meant wind was coming, but no more rain. He stopped and showed her the faint, twin crescents of a deer's track in the damp earth, and the heavier, more rounded print of a buffalo. He knelt and dug up a small, lumpy root, brushing the dirt from it and telling her it was food, that the earth provided for those who knew where to look. It was a slow, quiet education, a dismantling of her old world and the beginning of a new one. Their conversations were brief and practical. When he gave her more of the dried meat, she struggled to chew it, her jaw aching. "This is like a soft rock," she said, the complaint softened by a weary smile. A flicker of amusement touched his eyes. He answered without looking at her, his gaze on the horizon, a rock that feeds people. The quiet humor was unexpected, a small spark of warmth that made him seem less like a mythic figure and more like a man. It built a fragile bridge between their two very different worlds. Late on the second day, as the sun began to slant toward the horizon, he paused to check the leather bindings on his saddle. From a small pouch, he pulled a little carved wooden horse, no bigger than his thumb, its surface worn smooth. He held it for a moment, his expression softening in a way she had not seen before. "For Mika," he said, more to himself than to her. He saw her curious look. "My daughter, she waits." The word struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. A daughter. This quiet, self-sufficient man was a father. She had assumed, without realizing it, that he was alone, a solitary hunter, but he was tied to a life, to a family, to a wife. A sudden sharp pang of something she could not name went through her. Of course he had a wife, a Lakota woman who knew the language of the earth as well as he did, whose hands were strong and capable, a woman who belonged here. The realization left Eleanor feeling even more like an outsider, a piece of driftwood he had pulled from the flood. He was a widower, then a single father. The thought settled, changing the shape of him in her mind, adding a layer of sorrow and deep responsibility to his quiet strength. That night, as he built the fire, the knowledge sat between them. When it was time to sleep, he laid out a buffalo robe for her on one side of the fire. He then laid his own on the other side, leaving a clear and respectful distance between them. The fire was a small, warm boundary, a silent testament to his honor. He had saved her, and he had claimed nothing in return. His gaze, when it met hers, held no debt, no expectation. He simply looked at her as another human being, weary and in need of rest. Eleanor lay down on the soft fur, pulling her thin shawl around her shoulders. She watched him across the flames as he settled for the night, his back to a rock, his rifle resting beside him. He was a protector, not a captor, for the second night in a row, under the vast, star-filled Dakota sky. She felt safer with this silent stranger than she had ever felt in the crowded, judgmental town of Willow Bend. She was traveling toward a life she could not imagine, but for the first time, she felt she was traveling toward a choice that was real. On the third day, they crested a long, slow rise, and the world opened up before them. Cradled in a wide green valley carved by a meandering creek was the village. It was not a chaotic jumble of structures like Willow Bend, but a place of deliberate and profound order. A great circle of hide lodges, or teepees, stood tall against the sky, their painted tops pointing to the heavens like praying hands. Thin tendrils of smoke rose from their peaks, fragrant with cottonwood and roasting meat, weaving together in the still air before dissolving into the blue. It was a living place. The sound of it reached Eleanor before they were even halfway down the slope. Children, their laughter sharp and clear as bird song, chased one another in dizzying circles between the lodges. Dogs barked a lazy, welcoming chorus. Women moved with unhurried grace, carrying water skins from the creek or tending to racks where strips of buffalo meat dried in the sun. It was a picture of such vibrant, ordered community that it made her heart ache with a strange mix of wonder and a deep, unnerving sense of her own solitude. This was a world complete in itself, a world that had no place for a woman like her. As they drew closer, a hush fell over the activity. The children stopped their games to stare, their dark eyes wide with curiosity. The women paused their work, their faces turning toward the approaching horse. It was not a hostile silence, but one of deep, collective attention. Every eye was on the strange cargo Dakota brought with him, the white woman with the sun-colored hair and the ruined dress, her leg bound in a crude splint. Eleanor felt 100 gazes on her, each one a question. She lowered her own eyes, her face burning, feeling like a misplaced page torn from the wrong book. Dakota halted the horse in the center of the encampment and dismounted. And then a small whirlwind of a girl, no more than 5 years old, burst from the entrance of a nearby lodge and launched herself at him. "Eight," she cried, her voice filled with pure joy. "Father." She wrapped her small arms around the neck of Dakota, burying her face in his shoulder. He caught her effortlessly, his arms enfolding her, his stern face transformed by a smile of such love and tenderness that it took the breath from Eleanor. He murmured something to the child in the Lakota tongue, his voice a low, gentle rumble. For a moment, they were the only two people in the world. Then the little girl, Mika, turned her head. Her gaze fell upon Eleanor, who was still seated on the horse. The child's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of solemn, round-eyed wonder. She had the dark, intelligent eyes of her father. She looked at Eleanor not with fear, but as one might look at a creature never before seen, a bird with strange and impossible plumage. Slowly, she wriggled out of the arms of her father and took a hesitant step forward. She reached out a small, tentative hand and lightly touched the faded calico of the dress of Eleanor, her fingers tracing one of the small printed flowers as if to confirm it were real. The touch was feather-light, a question without words. A woman emerged from the same lodge. She was older, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her long gray hair in 2 neat braids. Her eyes, however, were not soft. They were like chips of black, polished stone, and they held no welcome. She looked at Eleanor, then at Dakota, and her mouth was a firm, unmoving line. This had to be Kanku, the mother of his late wife. Her presence was a silent, powerful judgment. Dakota spoke to her in their language, his tone respectful but firm. Kanku listened without expression, then gave a short, clipped nod and disappeared back inside the lodge. Dakota turned and lifted Eleanor from the horse as gently as if she were made of glass. He supported her as she hobbled on her good leg into the lodge, the unfamiliar weight on her ankle sending a dull ache up her leg. The inside of the teepee was a surprise. It was a spacious, circular room, the air smoky and warm. Buffalo robes covered the ground, and painted liners on the hide walls depicted scenes of hunts and battles. It felt sheltered, ancient, and deeply personal. Kanku was stirring a pot over the central fire. Without a word, she ladled a rich, fragrant stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to Eleanor. It was an offering of hospitality, a duty performed, but it came with a chilling absence of warmth. The stew was hot, but the silence was cold. Just then, a young man ducked through the lodge opening. He was tall and powerfully built, his face proud and angry. His eyes found Eleanor, and his lip curled in a silent snarl. He looked at her as if she were a snake coiled by the fire, a harbinger of bad luck. He spat a single word at Dakota, a word that sounded like a stone hitting a shield, wasiku. Though she did not know the word, she understood its meaning. It was an accusation. It meant white person. It meant intruder, enemy. The young man, Chaitin, turned and left as abruptly as he had entered, but his contempt lingered in the air like a foul smoke. Eleanor learned quickly that her promise to work was not a theoretical thing. Her new life began the next morning. Sitting on the ground outside the lodge of Dakota with a pile of dried corn and 2 stones, her task, assigned by the silent Kanku, was to grind the corn into meal. It was grueling, repetitive work. Her soft, uncalloused hands, accustomed to the smooth pages of a book, were soon red and raw. Blisters formed, broke, and bled onto the stone. Her back ached, her shoulders screamed in protest. She watched the other women, who performed their tasks with an easy, practiced grace, their hands strong and sure. Her own clumsiness was a constant source of shame. The days that followed were a blur of alien labor. She learned to scrape the last bits of flesh from a hide with a sharpened bone, the smell clinging to her for hours. She was shown how to cut strips of meat and hang them to dry, her fingers fumbling and slow. The most difficult task was learning to pull the long, tough sinew from the spine of a buffalo, and then to split it into fine threads for sewing. Her fingers were not nimble enough, and more than once she ruined a piece, earning a look of silent disapproval from Kanku. In the evenings, she would retreat into the lodge, her hands throbbing and stained, and weep in silence, overwhelmed by her own inadequacy. One evening, as she was trying to soothe her raw palms with a cool, damp cloth, Dakota sat down beside her. He did not speak for a long time. Then he held out a small, greasy pouch. It was a salve made of herbs and animal fat. "The skin will learn," he said quietly, his gaze on her hands. "Your spirit is already hard." His words were not pity. They were a statement of fact, a quiet acknowledgement of the strength he had seen in her from the beginning. Coming from this man of few words, the simple praise was more fortifying than 1,000 empty reassurances. She took the salve and worked it into her sore hands, the gesture and acceptance of his strange, quiet faith in her. Not all of her lessons were so harsh. Mika, the little girl, became her shadow. She was fascinated by Eleanor, by her strange clothes and stranger hair. One afternoon, as they sat outside the lodge, Mika pointed to a tall cottonwood tree whose leaves were trembling in the breeze. "Cheng," the little girl said, her pronunciation clear and precise. "Tree." Eleanor tried to repeat it. The sound that came out of her mouth was a clumsy, flattened version. It sounded more like a word for being tired or bored. Mika giggled, a bright, bubbling sound. She repeated the word, exaggerating the shape of her mouth. Chang. Eleanor tried again, with the same disastrous result. Mika dissolved into a fit of laughter so infectious that Kanku, who was mending a moccasin nearby, looked up. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of her stony mouth might have been the ghost of a smile. Soon, Eleanor found herself laughing too. A genuine, unrestrained laugh that felt like a release of all the tension and fear she had been holding inside. It was a small thing, a mispronounced word, but in that shared moment of humor, the crushing weight of her foreignness lifted, just for a little while. She remained an object of intense scrutiny. The people of the village watched her constantly. They observed her clumsy attempts to work, her interactions with Mika, the quiet way Dakota treated her. They did not shun her. No one was unkind, but they did not welcome her either. She existed under the blanket of the protection of Dakota. She belonged to his fire, and so she was to be tolerated. She would see women whispering together as she passed, their voices dropping to a murmur. Men would nod to her, a gesture of civility, but not of friendship. She was a curiosity, a problem, a question mark placed in the center of their ordered world. She had a roof, a place to sleep, and food to eat, but she was still utterly, profoundly alone. She had traded one form of isolation for another. The days bled one into the next, each one a lesson written in the language of soil and sinew, wind and fire. The world Eleanor had known, a world of printed words and straight lines, receded like a distant shore. Her new life was a relentless, practical education. She learned that a fire built in the lee of a rock, with the wood stacked just so, would hold against a prairie wind. She learned to read the clouds, to see the telltale mare's tails that foretold a change in weather, to smell the dampness in the air hours before the rain began. Dakota would point out the subtle differences in animal tracks, the deep, cloven heart of a buffalo's hoofprint versus the delicate, pointed mark of a deer. She was a clumsy student, but a persistent one. Her mind, so accustomed to memorizing verse, slowly learned to memorize the patterns of the earth. Her harshest teacher was Kanku. The old woman's instruction was a matter of gesture and stern example. 1 week, she placed a stiff, scraped hide in front of Eleanor, along with a sharpened awl and a bundle of dried sinew. The task was to fashion a simple pair of moccasins for Mika. Kanku demonstrated the first few stitches, her hands moving with a swift, economical precision that was both mesmerizing and deeply intimidating. Then she simply watched. Eleanor's first attempts were a disaster. Her hands, though tougher than they had been, were still awkward. The awl slipped, punching crooked holes. The sinew thread, stiff and unfamiliar, would not pull tight. She cut the hide a fraction of an inch too short in one spot. A mistake Kanku pointed to with a single, damning finger. An entire section of the precious, laboriously prepared hide was ruined. Kanku took the piece from her without a word and set her to another, less critical task, her silence more cutting than any scolding. That night, Eleanor huddled in her buffalo robe and cried, not from the sting of failure, but from the deep, aching feeling that she would never belong, that her hands would never learn this new and vital grammar. But the next morning, she sought Kanku out, took up a fresh piece of hide, and began again. The evenings were a time of quiet respite. The work was done. The village settled into a low murmur of conversation and laughter around the dozens of small fires. It was then that a different kind of learning took place. One clear, cold night, as the stars blazed with a brilliance she had never seen in the hazy skies of the east. Dakota pointed to a familiar cluster of 7 stars. "My people call that the camp of the 7 brothers," he said, his voice low. He told her a story of a great bear and the brave hunters who chased it into the sky, where they remained forever to guide the Lakota people. It was a story that wove the heavens and the earth together, making the vast, cold emptiness of the night a familiar, populated place. Eleanor listened, rapt. When he was finished, A long silence settled between them, comfortable and deep. She felt a need to offer something in return, to share a piece of her own world, a story that held meaning for her. "In my book," she began softly, "there is a story about a boy named David. He was a shepherd, small and young, and he had to fight a giant named Goliath. The giant was a great warrior, covered in armor and carrying a huge spear. Everyone was afraid of him, but David was not. He took only a sling and 5 smooth stones from a creek." She told him the rest of the story, of the boy's faith, of the single stone that found its mark, and of how the small and the brave could triumph over the large and the powerful. Dakota listened with that same profound stillness he had shown in the cave, his eyes on the fire, but his attention entirely on her words. He did not speak when she was finished, but he gave a slow, thoughtful nod. It was more than a story exchanged. It was a sharing of souls, a recognition that their 2 different worlds both understood the eternal truths of courage and faith. A bridge was being built, 1 word, 1 story at a time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the village began to open to her. The women, who had once turned their backs as she approached, now offered a slight nod or a quiet greeting. One woman, seeing her struggle to carry a heavy water skin from the creek, took one side of it without a word, helping her carry it back to the lodge. The change was most noticeable with the children. They were no longer content to just stare. They would gather around her, their curiosity overcoming their shyness. A boy pointed to a camp dog that was trotting past. "Sunka," he said, then looked at her expectantly. "Dog," Eleanor replied, pointing to the animal. "Dog," he repeated. The foreign word, a delightful game. Sunka. Soon a small chorus of children was chanting the 2 words, Sunka, dog, Sunka, dog. Their laughter a stitch that pulled her a little deeper into the fabric of the community. The most tangible measure of her progress was her own hands. The blisters had long since healed, replaced by a tough, protective layer of calloused skin. They were no longer the hands of a poet's reader. They were the hands of a woman who worked. Her stitches, once clumsy and uneven, were becoming smaller, tighter, more sure. Finally, she finished the moccasins for Mika. They were not beautiful. The seams were slightly crooked, the shape a little uneven, but she had made them. She had taken the raw material of this new world and fashioned something useful. She presented them to Mika with a heart full of trepidation. The little girl took them, her face serious. She sat on the ground and pulled them onto her small feet. She stood up, took a few steps, and then a huge, brilliant smile broke across her face. They fit. She ran to her father, pointing to her feet, her voice a torrent of happy, unintelligible Lakota. Eleanor looked down at her own scarred, capable hands and felt a surge of pride that was deeper and more satisfying than any praise she had ever received for her intellect. This fragile peace was disturbed by a visitor from the world she had left behind, a French-Canadian trapper, passing through on his way to the trading posts in the north, stopped for a night to trade for jerky and pemmican. His eyes widened when he saw Eleanor, her pale hair a stark beacon in the village of dark braids. He spoke to her in a rough mixture of English and French, his questions intrusive, his gaze lingering. She answered him politely but briefly, her discomfort a cold knot in her stomach. He left the next morning, but he took a story with him, a story that would grow and change with each telling, passed from one campfire to the next, the story of the captive white woman living with the Sioux. It was a simple, convenient narrative, one that fit neatly into the prejudices of the world outside the valley, a story that could easily be used as an excuse for violence. That evening, Dakota's face was grim. He sat with her by the fire, his usual quietness now heavy with concern. "That man," he said, "his words are like seeds on the wind. They will find soil in the forts and the gold camps." Eleanor felt a chill go through her. "They will say you took me against my will." "It is the story they want to hear," he confirmed. "Your people believe in paper. A man can lie, he can steal, he can kill, but if he has a piece of paper that says he is right, Other men will follow him. A spoken truth is just breath. It disappears. A written lie lasts forever. His words struck her with the force of revelation. He was right. She had run from a world of paper threats, of letters from men like Reeves, only to find herself vulnerable to an unwritten one. Her skill, the one thing she possessed that had been useless here, was the knowledge of that world of paper. "Then one day," she said, thinking aloud, "we may need a paper shield." He looked at her, a new understanding in his eyes. He saw that she was not just learning his world, but that she was remembering how to fight in her own. Their bond was not forged in grand declarations. It was built in the small, unspoken moments of each day. It was in the way that, when a cold wind blew from the north, he would subtly shift his position to stand between her and the blast. It was in the way he would leave a piece of roasted marrow, a delicacy, for her by the fire. It was in a shared look across the busy camp, his eyes asking a silent question. "Are you all right?" And her small nod in reply. These quiet gestures were the threads of a connection growing stronger each day, a love story being written not in words, but in the steady, constant language of care. The buffalo hunt was a success of a scale the village had not seen in several seasons. The hunters returned not with grim satisfaction, but with a deep, resonant joy that spread through the camp like the warmth of a fire. For days, the air was thick with the smells of industry, the sharp, coppery scent of fresh meat, the smoky perfume of hides being scraped and tanned over smoldering fires, the savory aroma of stews bubbling in clay pots. Every hand was busy, every heart was full. The specter of hunger, a constant and silent companion on the prairie, had been driven back into the wilderness, and when the work was done, it was time for the celebration. A great fire was built in the center of the camp circle, a roaring column of flame that threw sparks into the deep velvet of the night sky, challenging the dominion of the stars. The people gathered, their faces painted with the colors of joy, their bodies clad in their finest quill work and beadwork. And then the drumming began. It was not a sound Eleanor simply heard. It was a force she felt, a single, large drum, beaten by a half-dozen men in perfect, unified rhythm. The deep, powerful beat throbbed through the soles of her feet, vibrated in her bones, and seemed to sync with the beating of her own heart. It was the heartbeat of the village, the pulse of the land itself, made audible. Dancers moved into the firelight, their bodies telling the story of the hunt. They mimicked the lumbering gait of the great buffalo, the stealthy approach of the hunter, the swift, deadly flight of the arrow, and the final, solemn fall of the beast. It was a dance of gratitude, of power, and of deep, spiritual connection to the world that sustained them. Eleanor watched from the edge of the circle, wrapped in a borrowed robe, feeling like a ghost at a feast. She was a part of this community, and yet she was apart from it. She could learn their work, but she could not know the deep, ancient rhythm that moved in their blood. Dakota, who had been a quiet observer until now, rose and came to her side. He stood for a moment, watching the dancers, the firelight casting a bronze glow on his strong, serious face. Then he turned to her and held out his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a shock through her. It was an invitation to cross the final, invisible line that separated them. Panic fluttered in her chest. She, with her clumsy feet and her foreign soul, trying to move to this primal, sacred rhythm. She would be a mockery, a disruption. She shook her head, her eyes wide with refusal, and tried to pull back into the shadows. He did not let go of her gaze. He leaned closer, his voice a low whisper meant only for her, cutting through the thunder of the drum. "Do not think," he said. "Listen to the drum." His hand was still outstretched, patient, unwavering. She looked at his hand, then into his dark, steady eyes. In them, she saw no judgment, only a quiet and certain invitation. Taking a shaky breath, she placed her hand in his His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. He led her into the circle of dancers. The fire was hot on her face. The drumming, a physical wall of sound. She felt the eyes of the village on her, and her body froze, her limbs stiff with self-consciousness. She stumbled, her feet tangling, her mind a riot of embarrassment. Dakota's hand tightened on hers, a silent, steadying pressure. He leaned close again. "Listen," he whispered. She closed her eyes. She shut out the faces, the fire, the fear. She let the world fall away until there was nothing left but the beat. Thump, 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 thump. It was the rhythm of a running heart, of blood moving through veins, of life itself, and she let it move her. Her feet, without conscious thought, began to find the beat. Her body, released from the prison of her mind, began to sway. She moved tentatively at first, then with more confidence, a simple step, a slight turn, letting the great heartbeat of the drum carry her along. She opened her eyes and looked at Dakota. He was dancing opposite her, his movements fluid and powerful, but his eyes were on her, and for the first time, she saw a true, unguarded smile touch his lips and crinkle the corners of his eyes. It was a rare and beautiful sight, a glimpse of the joy that lay beneath his quiet, stoic surface. In that moment, watching him smile, feeling the rhythm of his people move through her own body, a profound and overwhelming wave of emotion washed over her. It was too much. The intensity of the feeling, the fire, the stares, the impossible reality of where she was and who she was with, it all crested at once. She broke from the circle, murmuring a panicked apology that was lost in the drumming, and fled from the light. She did not stop until she reached the creek that bordered the camp, the sound of the celebration fading behind her, replaced by the gentle murmur of water over stones. She sank to the ground on the damp bank, her heart hammering against her ribs. Here, in the cool, quiet dark, she could no longer deny the truth she had been holding at bay. She loved him. It was a love that was terrifying in its depth and its impossibility. She loved his quiet strength, his gentle hands, his rare and beautiful smile. She loved the way he moved through the world as if he were a part of it, not just a visitor, but with that love came a tidal wave of fear. Who was she to love a man like him? An outsider, a clumsy student who still burned the stew and broke the sinew thread. She thought of his first wife, the woman who had borne him a child, a Lakota woman who had surely danced this dance with grace and belonging. How could she, Eleanor, ever hope to fill that space? The chasm between their worlds seemed impossibly wide, and her love felt like a foolish, fragile bridge thrown across it. She heard a soft footstep on the grass behind her and knew, without turning, that it was him. He had followed her. He sat down on the bank a few feet away, leaving a respectful space between them, his presence a calm, unquestioning weight in the darkness. "The drum was too loud for you," he said. It was not a question, but a statement of understanding. "No," she whispered, her voice choked. "My heart was too loud." She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to hold herself together. "Dakota, I do not belong here. I try, but my hands are still clumsy. My tongue still speaks the wrong words. I will never be." She trailed off, unable to say the words. "I will never be one of you. I will never be her." He was silent for a long time, the only sound the soft gurgle of the creek. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain. "I chose you from the storm," he said. "I saw your spirit, and it was strong, but my choice is only half of the story. It is your choice that binds two people into one. It is your choice that makes a home." She turned to look at him then, his profile a stark, noble silhouette against the star-strewn sky. He had placed the power, the final decision, entirely in her hands. He was not claiming her. He was not assuming her love. He was asking for her consent, for her deliberate and conscious choice to join her life with his. She felt a tremor run through her, a deep and powerful shudder of fear and hope, and a love so overwhelming it left no room for breath. She moved closer to him, her movements slow and uncertain. "Is the first night scary?" she whispered, the words trembling in the cool night air. He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes searching hers. He reached out and drew her gently toward him, until she was kneeling before him. He pulled her close, not in a rough embrace, but in a gesture of profound tenderness. He pressed his forehead against hers, so that they were sharing the same breath, the same small space in the vast, dark world. "Only till you learn how sweet it feels," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel directly from his soul to hers. They stayed like that for a long, timeless moment, simply breathing together, their foreheads touching. His hands came up to cup her face, his calloused thumbs stroking her cheeks with a gentleness that made her want to weep. It was a language beyond words, a conversation of touch and breath, of trust and surrender. It was a promise of patience, of kindness, of a sweetness that had nothing to do with haste or demand. In the quiet darkness by the creek, with the distant heartbeat of the drum as their witness, she made her choice. The next morning, as the first pale light of dawn crept into the lodge, Eleanor awoke to find the fire stoked and Dakota watching her. The look in his eyes was different. The quiet care was still there, but it was joined by a new depth, a new intimacy. They were no longer protector and protected, teacher and student. They were partners, fellow travelers who had chosen to walk the same path. A quiet understanding flowed between them, as clear and deep as the creek water. As she sat up, pulling the robe around her shoulders, he spoke into the stillness of the new day. "Tomorrow will be harder," he said, his gaze steady and honest. He was not offering her a life without struggle. He was acknowledging the truth of their situation, the dangers that lay ahead. "But we have breath enough for the long walk." It was the most profound vow she had ever heard, a promise not of ease, but of endurance, a promise of shared breath, of walking side by side, whatever the trail might bring. Faintly, from across the camp, she could hear the last, slow beats of the ceremonial drum, a fading echo of the community's heart. It was a community that had not yet fully embraced her, but one that, after the night of the dance, no longer denied her place by the fire. The peace of their new, unspoken commitment was a fragile and beautiful thing, like the thin layer of ice that formed on the creek's edge in the quiet of the pre-dawn cold. It was a peace that existed within the protected circle of the village, but the world outside that circle was vast and full of echoes. The words of the French-Canadian trapper were not seeds on the wind. They were sparks, and the prairie, in that dry late summer season, was like tinder. The story found its first fertile ground at a rough-hewn trading post 100 miles to the north. In the telling, Eleanor was no longer a woman who had made a choice, but a tragic, beautiful captive, her hair a beacon of her lost civilization. The trapper, eager for a free drink and the attention of the grizzled prospectors and freight haulers, embellished his tale. He spoke of her fear, of the savage looks of the warriors, of the great chief who had claimed her. By the time the story had passed through a dozen mouths, carried along the gold trails and the military supply lines, it had become a legend, a righteous cause waiting for a champion. It eventually reached the ears of Captain Reeves, a man who collected causes the way he collected land deeds for profit. He heard the tale in a dusty saloon near a new army fort, and his eyes, small and hard as lead shot, had gleamed with opportunity. He rode not east toward the territorial capital, but south toward Willow Bend. He found Jed Kane in the back room of the Lucky Ace Saloon, a place that smelled of stale whiskey, cigar smoke, and avarice. Kane was poring over a ledger, his lips moving silently as he calculated his profits. He looked up, his face a mask of welcome that did not quite hide his annoyance at the interruption. "Captain Reeves," Jed said, gesturing to a chair. "An unexpected pleasure. What brings the long arm of the law to our humble town?" Reeves did not bother with pleasantries. He took a bottle from the table and poured himself a generous measure. I hear you lost one of your assets. Jed Kane's eyes narrowed. I do not know what you mean. A woman, Reeves said, downing the whiskey in one gulp. A blonde woman. The one you and your council of elders tried to put to work. Word is the Sioux have her. Snatched her right out from under your noses. Kane's composure was perfect. He leaned back in his chair, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. News travels fast, and it gets taller with every mile it rides. She was not taken. She walked away. A foolish, proud woman who did not appreciate the charity this town offered her. That is not the way the story is being told, Reeves said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. The way it is being told, a helpless white woman, an orphan, was abducted by savages. It is a tragedy. It is an outrage that cannot be allowed to stand. It requires a response, a firm, decisive response. Jed Kane was silent for a long moment, the abacus in his mind clicking furiously. He understood perfectly. This was not about Eleanor Hart. It was about the land the village occupied, the rich valley with its abundant water and grass. Land that would be worth a fortune once the railroad pushed through. Eleanor was not the prize. She was the key. A response would require men, Jed said softly, and ammunition. Both can be expensive. I have the men, Reeves growled. They are always eager for a righteous fight, especially one with potential rewards. You, my friend, have access to the supplies. He gestured around the room. At the crates of whiskey and the locked cabinets. You provide the means to see this justice done. And when that valley is pacified, we will have a great deal of new, unclaimed land to divide between us. A silent partnership. Jed Kane extended a soft, well-manicured hand across the table. It would be my honor, Captain, to contribute to the rescue of that poor, misguided girl. Back in the quiet valley, a different kind of tension was growing. Chayton, the young warrior whose hostility had slowly transformed into a grudging respect, approached Dakota as he repaired an arrow shaft. I do not like the smell of the wind, Chayton said, his eyes scanning the distant horizon. I smell iron, the stink of a rifle barrel left too long in the sun. Dakota did not look up from his work, but his hands stilled. You have seen something. No, Chayton admitted, but I have heard things. Whispers from a Cheyenne hunting party who crossed the trail to the north. They speak of angry white men talking of a stolen woman. They speak your name. The unspoken threat hung between them. Dakota nodded slowly, his face grim. The peace was over. The outside world was coming. Mika, who had been playing nearby, seemed to sense the change in the air. The joy went out of her small face, replaced by a child's deep, instinctual fear of adult troubles. She ran to Eleanor, who was grinding corn nearby, and buried her face in her skirts, her small body trembling. Eleanor wrapped her arms around the little girl, stroking her hair, her eyes meeting Dakota's over the child's head in a look of shared, silent dread. In the face of this new, invisible threat, Eleanor's role in the village began to shift. Her clumsiness with a hide scraper was no longer a mark of her otherness. Her knowledge of the white world was now a vital asset. She began to teach the children. There was no schoolhouse, no slates, no books. She would gather them in the shade of a great cottonwood tree, and with a piece of charcoal on a smooth, scraped piece of buckskin, she would draw the strange, angular shapes of her alphabet. A, B, C. The children, quick and bright, would copy them, their laughter ringing out as they tried to form the unfamiliar sounds. It was a bridge, a way for them to understand the world that was pressing in on them. Soon, the elders began to seek her out. An old chief, his face a noble mask of wrinkles, brought her a piece of paper, a treaty signed years ago. It had been read to them by a fast-talking man in a blue coat, and it had promised them peace and protection. Eleanor took the document, her heart heavy. She read the grand, flowing language of the main paragraphs, which spoke of eternal friendship and inviolable borders. But then she read the small print at the bottom, She read of clauses that allowed for the building of roads and forts, of lines that granted grazing rights to cattle herds that did not yet exist, of language that ceded mineral rights for land that had not yet been surveyed. It was a document full of traps, a cage of words. The chief and the other elders listened, their faces growing hard and still as she explained the meaning of each legalistic phrase. She was no longer just a woman who had been saved from a storm. She was a translator, a decipherer of the enemy's codes. "You were right," she said to Dakota late one night. "The treaty document lying between them, their lies last forever on paper. When they come, we must have a paper shield of our own." The very air seemed to change. The clear, bright blue of the late summer sky was replaced by a hazy, ominous gray. The wind whispered through the tall grass with a mournful, sighing sound, and high above, a flock of buzzards began to circle, their dark shapes stark against the pale sky. They rode the thermal currents in slow, patient loops, waiting. The quiet domesticity of their life in the lodge took on a new, precious weight. Every shared meal, every quiet moment felt like something that could be stolen. One night, as they lay on their separate robes on either side of the dying fire, Dakota rose and came to her. He knelt beside her and placed something heavy and cool in her hand. It was his knife. "If they come," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper in the darkness, "I will stand before the lodge, but men fall. If I fall, you will take this. You will take Mika and run to the caves by the creek. You will protect her first, before yourself. Do you understand?" Eleanor's fingers closed around the smooth, worn handle of the knife. The weight of it was terrifying. It was the weight of his trust, the weight of a child's life. She could not speak. She could only nod, her throat tight with a fear that was not for herself, but for him, and for the small, sleeping girl who lay nearby. The next evening, as Eleanor sat mending a tear in one of Mika's small dresses, Kanku approached her. The old woman had remained a figure of stern, silent judgment, her acceptance of Eleanor a thing of duty rather than warmth. But now, her face was different. The hardness was still there, but it was overlaid with a deep, profound sorrow. She held something in her hands. It was a necklace, a beautiful, intricate piece of quill work, the dyed porcupine quills woven into a pattern of suns and stars on a strip of soft hide. It was a piece of incredible artistry, something that would have taken many months to create. Kanku held it out to Eleanor. "This was my daughter's," Kanku said, her voice rough with unused emotion. "She wore it on the day she joined with Dakota." Eleanor stared at the necklace, her heart stopping. She could not take this. It was too sacred, too personal. It was the legacy of the woman she could never be. She started to shake her head, to push it away. But Kanku's gaze was firm. "She is gone. The spirits have taken her. But her child remains. Her husband remains. Her home remains." She took Eleanor's hand and pressed the necklace into it. Her old, work-hardened fingers closed over Eleanor's. "This is not to replace her. No one can be replaced. This is to continue. The circle must not be broken." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as Kanku took the necklace and tied it around her neck. The soft leather was cool against her skin. It was not a gift. It was an anointing. It was the final, absolute mark of her acceptance. Kanku, the keeper of the family's heart, had just named her as a vital link in the chain of their survival. She was no longer Waseku. She was one of them. And the enemy was coming to tear her new world apart. The morning broke with a strange and suffocating warmth. A hazy, copper-colored light filtered through the smoke holes of the lodges, carrying no promise of a clear day. The air was unnaturally still, the usual prairie breeze having died in the night, leaving a silence that was heavy and expectant. The birds were quiet. Even the camp dogs lay panting in the shade, their ears twitching at sounds no human could yet hear. A profound sense of wrongness settled over the valley. The women worked with a quiet, tense efficiency, keeping the children close, their laughter and games hushed. The men did not go out to check their horse herds. They stood in small, silent groups, their eyes fixed on the long slope that led into the valley, their hands never far from the bows and rifles that leaned against their lodges. They came near mid-morning, a dark centipede of men and horses cresting the rise and spilling down into the valley. There were a dozen of them, a rough collection of men whose faces were hard with greed and cheap whiskey. They rode not as soldiers, but as a pack of dogs, loose and undisciplined, kicking up a cloud of red dust that rose behind them like a bloody mist. At their head rode Captain Reeves, his face flushed, his body ramrod straight in the saddle, a man playing the part of a righteous avenger. Their voices, raw and ugly, tore the still air. "We have come for the white woman. Give us the captive girl, and no one gets hurt. Come out, you heathens. We are here to rescue her." The shouts were a desecration of the morning's peace. Inside the lodge, Eleanor's heart seized in her chest. She grabbed Mika and pulled the child into her arms, pressing the little girl's face into her shoulder to muffle the terrible sounds. Mika was trembling, her small body rigid with a fear she was too young to understand. Kanku moved to the lodge entrance, her face a mask of stone, and pulled the flap almost closed, leaving only a narrow slit through which to see. Eleanor's hand went instinctively to the knife Dakota had given her, its handle a cold, solid reality in her sweating palm. Outside, the Lakota men moved to form a line before the central fire. They were outnumbered, and they were outgunned, but they stood with a quiet, rooted dignity that made the posse on their horses look like frantic, noisy fools. Chayton was at the front, his face a storm of fury, a quiver of arrows on his back. And then Dakota walked through the line of warriors. He stopped 20 paces from Reeves, his hands held open at his sides, empty. He was a lone man, unarmed, facing down a dozen rifles. "There is no captive here," Dakota said, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily in the still air. "The woman you seek is here by her own choice." Reeves let out a short, ugly bark of a laugh. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. An Indian's word, he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "It is worth less than the dirt I spit in. We all know your kind. You took her. Now give her back before we burn this whole camp to the ground and take her back over your dead bodies." One of the men in the posse, a young man with nervous eyes, shifted in his saddle. His horse, agitated by the tension in the air, suddenly sidestepped and reared. The man's hand tightened on his rifle, and in his panic, his fingers slipped on the trigger. The shot was an obscene crack that shattered the world. It went wild, whining harmlessly over the tops of the lodges. But it was the spark that lit the fuse. The air exploded into a nightmare of chaos. The deep boom of the posse's rifles was answered by the high, sharp hum of arrows. Horses screamed, rearing and plunging, their riders cursing and fighting to control them. It was not a battle. It was a convulsion, a brief, brutal spasm of violence. Eleanor, peering through the slit in the lodge flap, watched in horror. She saw a warrior fall, an arrow in his own leg from a comrade's bow in the confusion. She saw one of Reeves' men slump forward over his horse's neck, a dark stain spreading across his back. Her eyes searched desperately for one man. She saw him. Dakota had moved with the speed of a striking snake when the first shot was fired, diving for his own rifle that leaned against a drying rack. He brought it to his shoulder just as a bullet sang past his head. He fired, and one of the riders cried out and clutched his arm, and then another bullet, a ricochet off a stone, struck the side of his head. It was a glancing blow, but the force of it sent him staggering. He dropped to one knee, his rifle falling from his grasp, one hand going to his forehead. Blood, dark and shockingly red, streamed through his fingers and down his face. Seeing him fall broke the paralysis that had held Eleanor in its icy grip. A sound tore from her own throat, a sound of rage and despair. She thrust Mika into Kanku's arms, her hand closing around the handle of the knife with a grip of iron. "Protect her," she gasped, and then she was moving. She burst from the lodge and ran, her feet flying over the trampled grass. She ran past the startled warriors, past the chaos and the shouting, and she did not stop until she was standing in the open space between the two lines, directly in front of the kneeling, bloodied figure of Dakota. She was a human wall. She raised the knife, not as a weapon she knew how to use, but as a symbol, a final, desperate statement. The fighting faltered. The sudden appearance of this woman, the very prize they were fighting for, standing as a shield for her supposed captor, was so unexpected it shocked both sides into a momentary stillness. Reeves stared at her, his mouth agape. "Girl, get out of the way! We are here to save you!" Eleanor's eyes blazed with a fire he had never seen in a woman. She planted her feet in the dirt of her home, and her voice rang out, clear and steady, with no trace of a tremor. She spoke in English, for them. "I am not a prisoner," she declared, her voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. "This is my home." Then she turned her head slightly, so that her voice would carry to Chaitin and the other warriors who were staring at her in stunned disbelief. She spoke in their own tongue, the words clumsy on her tongue, but the meaning absolute. Her voice broke with the force of her emotion, but it was as loud and resonant as a drumbeat. "My heart is here." The effect was profound. The men of the posse lowered their rifles, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. The heroic narrative they had ridden in on had just been utterly and publicly destroyed by the very person they had come to save. She was not a cowering victim. She was a defiant guardian. Chaitin's eyes, which had always held a measure of suspicion, now widened with a new and stunning understanding. In that moment, he no longer saw a white woman, an outsider. He saw one of his own, a woman with the heart of a warrior, willing to stand before rifle barrels for one of their people. Reeves's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. His plan, his righteous cause, his claim to the land had all been shot to pieces by two simple sentences. He could not shoot her. He would be a murderer, not a hero. He was trapped. "She is bewitched," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "The savage has put a spell on her. She is a witch." But his words were hollow. The desperate flailing of a man who had lost control. The momentum was gone. The righteous fire in his men's bellies had been extinguished, replaced by a sullen, confused shame. He knew it was over. He snarled an order, wheeling his horse around. His men followed, some of them not even bothering to look back. They scooped up their one wounded man, but they left the two bodies where they had fallen in the dirt. They retreated back up the long slope, their departure as messy and chaotic as their arrival. They left behind a silence that was filled with the smell of gunpowder and the sight of their dead. And they left behind a debt, an account of blood and honor that was far from settled. The silence that descended after the posse's retreat was heavier and more profound than the noise that had preceded it. It was a silence thick with the smell of spent gunpowder, the coppery tang of blood, and the ozone scent of violence. The living moved through this quiet with a slow, deliberate purpose, their faces grim. The women emerged from the lodges, their movements swift and sure, to tend to the wounded. Eleanor's world had narrowed to the space of a few feet, to the man kneeling in the dirt before her. She dropped the knife. Its purpose served, and went to him. The gash on his forehead was ugly, bleeding freely, but she saw with a surge of desperate relief that his eyes were clear, focused on her. He had not lost consciousness. He reached up, and his fingers found the quill necklace Kanku had given her. His touch a question and a confirmation all in one. She helped him to his feet, his weight leaning on her, and together they walked back to their lodge. Inside, Kanku was holding a terrified Mika, murmuring to her in low, soothing Lakota. Eleanor settled Dakota on a buffalo robe and, with a bowl of water Kanku brought her, she began to clean his wound. Her hands, once so clumsy, were steady now. She washed away the blood and dirt with a soft piece of hide, her touch gentle. The bullet had torn a furrow across his temple, a breath away from being a fatal blow. Kanku handed her a poultice of herbs, and she applied it carefully, binding his head with a clean strip of cloth. Throughout it all, he was silent, his eyes never leaving her face. The village had one warrior to mourn, a young man, barely 18 summers old, who had been struck in the chest during the first chaotic volley of shots. The grief of the village was a deep, powerful current, but it was not the loud, performative sorrow Eleanor had known in her old life. There was no wailing, no tearing of clothes. There was a shared, heavy silence, a community holding its pain together. The young man's body was wrapped in his finest robe and placed on a scaffold, to lift him closer to the sky and the spirit world. His favorite horse was tethered nearby, its mane braided with sacred herbs. Eleanor stood with the other women, her hand holding Mika's, and she wept. Her tears were not the detached sympathy of an outsider. They were the hot, aching tears of a family member, of someone who had lost one of their own. She cried for the boy's stolen youth, for the future he would never have, and for the senseless violence that had brought the shadow of death to this peaceful valley. Later that day, after the solemn rites were completed, Chaitan approached her. He had avoided her eyes since the fight, his face a mask of complicated, conflicting emotions. He stopped directly in front of her, his tall frame blocking the afternoon sun. He looked not at her face, but at the ground between them. "You stood with us," he said. The words were not an apology for his past suspicions. They were not a declaration of friendship. They were a simple, profound statement of fact. A warrior's acknowledgement of courage. It was the highest praise he could give, and it was all that was needed. In that moment, the last wall between her and the heart of the village crumbled into dust. A few days later, as the raw edge of grief began to soften into memory, the village elders came to their lodge. An old man, a holy man with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of 1,000 winters, carried a large, beautifully woven buffalo robe. He spoke to Dakota and Eleanor, his voice a low, gentle rasp. He spoke of the strength of two people who choose to walk one path, of the need to make a new, strong rope to replace a strand that had been broken. He led them to the center of the camp circle, where the people had gathered in a quiet, expectant ring. He had them stand side by side, and then he and another elder took the large robe and draped it around both of their shoulders, enclosing them in a single, shared shelter. "One home," the old man said, his voice resonating with ancient authority. "One fire, one life." Then Kanku stepped forward. Her face, for the first time, was soft, her stone-like eyes glistening with unshed tears. She reached out and gently touched the quill necklace that Eleanor wore, the necklace of her own lost daughter. She adjusted it slightly, a final, public gesture of placement, of acceptance. She was not just giving Eleanor a place in her family, she was weaving her into its very soul. It was not a replacement, but a continuation. The circle, unbroken. Life settled into a new rhythm, a quiet interlude of healing and strengthening. But Eleanor had not forgotten Dakota's words, nor her own realization. A paper shield was needed. Her opportunity came several weeks later, with the arrival of a young traveling minister, a man named Father Michael, whose horse had gone lame. He was a kind, earnest young man with a face that had not yet been hardened by the frontier, and he was grateful for the village's offer of food and shelter. That evening, Eleanor sought him out. She explained her situation simply and honestly, without melodrama. She told him of her life in Willow Bend, and of her free choice to make her home with the Lakota. "We have been joined in the eyes of his people," she explained, "but in the eyes of the law of my people. I am a captive and he is a criminal. Captain Reeves and men like him will use that as an excuse to bring more violence here. I need a piece of paper. Father, I need a document that their world will recognize." The young minister was taken aback, his mind struggling to reconcile the wild stories he had heard with the intelligent, articulate woman who stood before him. He saw the way Dakota looked at her, the deep, quiet respect in his eyes. He saw the love and trust with which little Mika clung to her hand. He saw a family, not a prison. I see, he stammered. It would be highly irregular, but the law of God is a law of love and truth. I will do it. And so, the next morning, under the vast, open sky of the Dakota prairie, with the circle of lodges as their church and the elders of the village as their witnesses, Father Michael performed another wedding. He read from his small, worn Bible, his voice a little shaky in the face of such a strange congregation, and he filled out a marriage certificate, with its formal, looping script, declaring Eleanor Hart and Dakota to be lawfully wedded husband and wife. Dakota signed with a simple, cross-like mark, and Eleanor signed her own name in clear, firm letters beside it. She folded the document carefully and tucked it away. It was a strange, flimsy shield against a world of rifles and greed, but it was a shield nonetheless, with her place in the village now solidified in both heart and law. Eleanor found her true calling. She started a school without walls. Each day, she would gather the children in a shady spot, and she would teach. She taught them their English letters, drawing them in the dirt or with charcoal on hide, and in return, they taught her more of their language. It was a joyous exchange. The children would shout with laughter as they learned to write the word dog and then, right beside it, the Lakota word sunka. Their bright, happy voices were a constant music in the camp, a sound of hope that was louder than the lonely sigh of the wind. Her work extended to the elders. They would come to her with the treaties and documents the white men had given them over the years. She would sit with them for hours, patiently deciphering the convoluted legal language, pointing out the traps hidden in the tiny print. The small words are the big traps. She would tell them, and they would nod, their faces grim. She knew she could not stop the flood that was coming, but she could help her new people learn to navigate the treacherous currents. Her love for Dakota deepened and matured, not in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of their shared life. It was in the way she mended his moccasins, her stitches now strong and even. It was in the way he would save the best piece of roasted meat for her. It was in the long, dark nights, when one of them would stand watch for a few hours, a silent guardian, while the other slept a deep and trusting sleep. The world outside the valley had not forgotten them. The whispers from the forts and the settlements still carried the names of Jed Kane and Captain Reeves. The grudge was still held. The defeat was still a raw wound that festered in the hearts of angry men. The threat was a constant, low rumble on the horizon. But something fundamental had changed. The village was no longer just a collection of people tolerating an outsider. They had faced a threat together, and they had become a single, unified body. The community had become a shield. The seasons turned, braiding themselves into the long, slow story of the valley. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn, a season that painted the prairie in hues of russet and pale straw. Years had passed, enough to silver the hair at Eleanor's temples and to etch fine, gentle lines around her eyes. But the brilliant, clear blue of her gaze was undimmed. It was the gaze of a woman who knew her own heart, who had seen the world and had chosen her small, significant piece of it. Her life was a tapestry woven from the threads of two worlds. Her hands, no longer soft, were skilled in the arts of the Lakota. She could tan a hide, sew a watertight seam with an awl and sinew, and read the coming weather in the sky. But she also moved through the world of the written word, a world that was slowly, inexorably pressing in on the valley. She was a woman of two languages, of two ways of knowing, and in the space between them, she had built a home. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows from the lodges, a rider appeared on the ridge. This was not unusual. Trappers and sometimes even lost soldiers would occasionally find their way to the village, seeking trade or directions. But this rider was different. It was a young woman, riding astride a weary-looking army horse, her posture slumped with exhaustion and fear. She wore the drab, buttoned-up dress of a fort dweller, a uniform of a world away. And it was clear she was not merely lost, she was fleeing. She rode into the center of the camp, her eyes wide and searching. A few of the women stopped their work to watch her, their expressions not hostile, but cautious. The young woman slid from her horse, her legs trembling. She asked, her voice a raw whisper, "I am looking for a woman. They call her Eleanor of the Lakota." Eleanor, who had been helping Mika sort dried herbs, stepped forward. "I am Eleanor," she said gently. The young woman's face, pale and streaked with dust, crumpled with a relief so profound it was painful to watch. She introduced herself as Sarah, a laundress from the new fort that had been built 30 miles to the east. Her story tumbled out in a torrent of whispered, desperate words. Her father, a sergeant, had arranged a marriage for her. The man was a wealthy landowner, a friend of Captain Reeves, a man with a great deal of power and a reputation for cruelty. She was to be his wife in 2 weeks' time. Her father had called it a great opportunity, a secure future. Sarah called it a sentence. She had heard the stories, the legend of the white woman who had chosen a different life, and in the dead of night, she had stolen a horse and ridden away, with only that fragile whisper of a story to guide her. Eleanor led the girl to her lodge, sat her down by the fire, and gave her a bowl of warm broth. She listened patiently, her heart aching with a deep, familiar sorrow. She saw her own past reflected in the terrified eyes of this young woman. The same false choices, the same gilded cage being presented as a sanctuary. When Sarah had finished, her story hanging in the quiet air of the lodge, Eleanor reached out and took the girl's hand. Sarah's hand was soft, uncalloused, the hand of a woman who had been sheltered from the hard truths of the world. "I know your fear," Eleanor said, her voice soft but firm. "They will build you a house with strong walls and tell you that you are safe. They will give you fine dresses and tell you that you are fortunate. They will call the cage a home, and they will expect you to be grateful for its bars. That is one path." She paused, her grip on the girl's hand tightening slightly. "But there is another path, the one I took. It begins in the heart of the storm. It is a third path, the one you must cut for yourself." Sarah looked at her, her eyes full of a desperate, flickering hope. "But I am afraid. I do not know how to live out there. I will die." Eleanor's expression softened. "All new things are frightening at first." She settled back on the robe, her eyes taking on a faraway look as she traveled back through the landscape of her own memory. "The night I chose this life. I was by the creek, just as you are here by this fire. I was full of fear. I was sure I was too weak, too clumsy, too different. I believed I was not enough." She told Sarah the story of the dance, of her flight to the water's edge, and of Dakota's quiet arrival. She spoke of her own overwhelming love and her equally overwhelming doubt. "I looked at this man, this life, and it felt as impossible as trying to touch a star. I was trembling so hard I thought my bones would break apart." Eleanor's voice dropped to an intimate whisper, sharing the most sacred part of her own story. I asked him, "Is the first night scary?" He did not laugh. He did not dismiss my fear. He drew me close until our foreheads were touching, and he said, his voice so gentle, "Only till you learn how sweet it feels." She looked directly into the eyes of Sarah. He was not speaking only of the marriage bed. Child, he was speaking of the fear of the unknown. He was promising me that the choice, the true and free choice of one person for another, holds a sweetness that is stronger than any fear. Love, true love, is not a decision that is made for you. It is a choice you make and keep making. Every day, it is an act of consent. Tears streamed silently down the face of Sarah, but they were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of understanding, of a hope that was beginning to take root in the desolate soil of her heart. But Eleanor's help did not end with words of comfort and inspiration. Hope, she knew, needed a map. She unrolled a piece of tanned hide on which she had drawn the rivers, the hills, and the settlements of the surrounding territory. "You will not die," Eleanor said, her voice now practical and sharp. "You will ride north for 2 days, keeping this line of hills to your left. You will come to a trading post run by a man named McGregor. His wife is a Cheyenne woman. Tell him Eleanor sent you. He is a good man. He will give you supplies and point you toward the mountains. There is a valley there, a hidden place where many people who have chosen the third path have made a life. You will be safe there. You will work hard, but you will be free." She gave Sarah a bundle of dried meat and a water skin. She gave her a warm buffalo robe to ward off the autumn chill. She was not just offering a story, she was offering a tangible, practical escape. She was turning a desperate hope into a viable plan. Just then, a young woman entered the lodge. She was tall and graceful, with her father's dark eyes and a dusting of her mother's sun-colored highlights in her long, dark braids. It was Mika, now a woman grown, her presence a quiet blend of 2 strong cultures. She smiled at Sarah, a warm, reassuring smile that held no judgment. She spoke in English, her voice clear and unaccented. "Do not be afraid. The horse you rode is tired. I have brought you a fresh one, a fast one who knows the trails." Then she turned to her mother and said something in Lakota, her tone full of concern, and Eleanor answered in the same tongue, a seamless flow of language and love between them. Mika was the living proof of the third path, a bridge between 2 worlds. Outside the lodge, a group of children were playing. They were chasing a dog, their laughter echoing through the camp. Eleanor could hear them shouting in a joyful mixture of languages, "Come here, Sunka, fast! Come here, dog!" They were the children of her wall-less school, the next generation, their minds already open to a world larger than the one their grandparents had known. The future would not be easy. The forts were growing larger. The tide of the white world was rising, and the conflicts would surely continue. There would be more storms. But Eleanor looked at her daughter, at the bilingual children, at the young woman now riding away with a map and a future, and she knew her life had not been a simple act of survival. It had been an act of creation. They had built something new here. Many hands in this valley now knew how to build a shelter against a rising wind. Many eyes now knew how to read the small, treacherous print that could steal a future. That evening, as the sun set, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and violet, Eleanor stood outside her lodge. Dakota came to stand beside her, his presence as familiar and comforting as her own heartbeat. He did not speak, but his arm came around her shoulders, a simple, profound gesture of a lifetime of shared choices. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her silvery hair mingling with his dark braids. She looked out at the vast, beautiful, and dangerous land that had become her home, and she whispered, more to the prairie than to herself, "We chose each other, and we choose again each day." The light faded from the sky, and the stars began to appear. From inside their lodge, the small, warm light of the central fire began to glow, a tiny, defiant pulse in the great, gathering darkness, like a strong and steady heart, still beating. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.